I should have been around 13 at the time when this happened. My family lived in a big, comfortable house with wide hallways. We owned the property, and to the side of the main house, there was a smaller, modest home that my parents had built for tenants to reside in. Over the years, the smaller house had been rented out to different tenants. Some stayed for years, others for just a short while. It was a few weeks before Christmas in 2014 when a new tenant moved in, a middle-aged man named John. He seemed perfect, quiet, polite, and respectful. My dad had been relieved to find the kind of tenant he had been looking for. But unfortunately, a few days after he moved in, we started noticing strange noises at odd hours of the night. There were loud, disturbing footsteps, the sound of heavy furniture moving, and, most unsettling, the loud noises of him yelling as if he were shouting at someone, except he lived alone. My dad went over one evening to ask him to keep the noise down. John simply apologized, but my dad didn't entirely buy it. There was something about the man that unsettled him. On Christmas Eve, our family hosted a big dinner with plenty of relatives and friends filling our spacious dining room. I can vividly remember that John was also invited, but he hadn't shown up. It was a blissful night, with laughter and chatter filling the air as the table was piled high with food. After dinner, my cousin Chris excused himself to the front porch. A little while later, his other phone, which he had left behind, started ringing on the dining table. My dad handed it to me and told me to bring it to him. I grabbed the phone and walked toward the porch, but as I passed the hallway leading to it, something caught my attention. The room to the side had its door open, and through it, I saw a faint figure of a human trying to peek through from outside. Almost as soon as I saw it, the figure retracted. I quickly walked to the window, and what I saw was a man walking away. All I could see was his back as he disappeared into the shadows. Curious, I reluctantly called out Chris's name, even though I knew quite well that wasn't what Chris had been wearing earlier. For some reason, my impulse just made me call out his name. Some optimistic side of me just wanted it to be someone I knew and not a strange individual I had caught trying to peek, but there was no response. I left and headed to the front door. As soon as I stepped out, I saw Chris sitting on the front porch, staring at his screen, wearing the same clothes I knew he had on. It became obvious. It wasn't Chris I saw from the window. Still, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. It possibly might be someone from the neighborhood, or maybe just someone wandering around. I glanced in that direction and saw no one, so I went back inside. Later that night, after the relatives had left and the house had quieted down, I stayed up in the living room, watching a Christmas movie by the warm glow of the fireplace and tree. The cozy atmosphere eventually lulled me to sleep on the couch. I woke up around 2 a.m. to an eerie stillness. The fire had died out, and the movie had long since ended. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me: the faint sound of creaking floorboards. I simply thought it was my parents or my siblings moving around. I lay there, listening intently as the sound of soft footsteps moved closer. My view of the hallway was blocked by the Christmas tree, but I could hear someone shuffling near it. Then I heard the faint jingle of an ornament being disturbed. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was. A man stood behind the tree, half hidden in the shadows. His face was calm, and his eyes locked onto mine. It took a few seconds before I realized it was John, the new tenant, and he was wearing the same clothes as the person I had seen peeking through the window earlier. At that moment, it became clear. It had been John I saw earlier that night. 3 questions immediately sprang to my mind. Why is he here at this time of the hour? How did he get in? And why was he just standing there, staring at me? Almost immediately, he lunged toward me, but I scrambled off the couch, backing away, screaming like I was auditioning for a slasher film, high-pitched and completely unmanly. I never thought I could scream like that, but there I was, sounding like a little princess. My dad came bursting out of his room, yelling and charging into the living room. John hesitated for only a second before turning and bolting out the back door. My dad chased after him into the yard, but he was fast. He ran straight past the small house where he was supposed to be staying and vanished into the night. As soon as I told my dad it was the tenant, he became enraged and decided to check John's house. He grabbed a spare key and went straight to the apartment. As he tried to open it, he noticed the door wasn't locked. He opened it and stepped in. The apartment was almost completely empty. The only items in the entire space were a single mattress on the floor, a backpack, and a small stack of papers. My dad opened the backpack and found duct tape, gloves, and a large hunting knife. We backed out of the apartment immediately and called the police. They arrived within the hour and took everything as evidence. They confirmed John had a long history of criminal behavior, including stalking and attempted burglary. He had apparently been planning something far more dangerous than we could have imagined. John was never caught. The police later cleared out everything he had left behind on court orders. My dad, heartbroken and shaken by the betrayal, decided never to rent out the apartment again. For years, it stood empty, a silent reminder of how wrong appearances can be. If you are here for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. Also, like and share to your family and friends. Your support truly means a lot. This happened on the night of December 24th, 2016. That was the day I thought it was over, but somehow, in some way, I lived to tell the story. I had a little tradition I'd shared with Eric since we were kids. We'd always gone to the local farm to cut down our Christmas trees. But that year, I wanted to make things interesting. Red Pines Forest was massive, untouched in places, and filled with towering evergreens. I thought it would be the perfect spot to find the ultimate Christmas tree. We parked on a dirt path, hidden under a fresh layer of snow. Armed with a hatchet, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee, we set out into the woods. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The snow muffled everything. No birds, no animals, nothing. I'm usually very fearless, even if I do feel the need to be afraid. But what I encountered later, there is literally no one on earth that would claim to be fearless under that situation. We kept walking, and I eventually spotted the perfect tree. It was tall, symmetrical, exactly what I wanted. This one, I called, pulling out the hatchet. I swung the blade into the trunk, the satisfying thunk echoing through the still air. But just as I was about to go for another swing, a sharp crack came from the trees behind us. We both froze. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered, gripping my arm. "Probably just a deer," I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I hoped. Eric scanned the woods with his flashlight, and for a split second I saw it, a figure darting behind a tree. Not an animal, a person. We were no longer alone. "Who are you? What do you want?" Eric yelled, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a machete. Eric grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Forget the tree. We need to go." I wasn't about to argue. We turned and started walking quickly, then running. Immediately, heavy footsteps pounded through the snow behind us, faster and closer with every second. "Faster!" I shouted, and we bolted. We didn't stop until we couldn't hear him anymore. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. I thought we were in the clear. But then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath me gave way. A rope snapped tight around my ankle, yanking me into the air. I screamed, dangling upside down from a tree, swaying back and forth like some kind of bait. Eric ran back to me, his face pale with fear. He grabbed the rope, pulling it with all his strength. "Hold on, James. I'm getting you down," he shouted, his breath coming out in quick clouds in the cold air. The rope was tight, cutting into my ankle as I hung there helplessly. "Eric, hurry," I yelled, trying to stay calm and keep an eye on the trees behind him. I heard a low whistle again, sharp and clear. My heart sank when I saw the man step out of the shadows, machete shining in the moonlight. Eric didn't look back. He yanked at the rope, his hands shaking from the cold and the weight. Finally, with one last pull, the knot came loose, and I fell to the ground with a thud. Pain shot through my leg, but the fear kept me going. I quickly got to my feet as Eric grabbed my arm. "We need to go," he shouted. We ran without looking back, hearing the man's heavy steps behind us. The forest was dark, full of trees and branches reaching out at us. Eric's flashlight shook, but it gave us just enough light to find a way through. We ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. When we finally saw the truck, relief washed over me. "We made it," I gasped, but then a loud bang echoed through the forest. A bullet whizzed past us, splintering a tree trunk. "He has a gun!" I screamed. "Just keep running!" I shouted, fumbling with the keys when I reached the truck. We heard the shots again before I got the door finally opened. We dove inside, slamming the doors shut. I turned on the engine and floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning uselessly in the snow before catching traction. The truck lurched forward. The man didn't stop. He fired 2 more shots, one hitting the tailgate, the other bouncing off the rear bumper. As we sped down the road, I looked back to see him standing in the middle of the path, machete in one hand, gun in the other. He just stood there, watching us until the forest swallowed him up. We didn't stop driving until we reached a gas station on the edge of town. I've never been so happy to see fluorescent lights in a parking lot full of cars. We called the cops, but when they searched the forest, they didn't find anything. No man, no rope, no machete, just a bloody patch of snow and the tree we never brought home. Eric and I haven't gone back to Red Pines since. Every Christmas I settle for an artificial tree. The encounter till today was the most terrifying night of my life. I had planned to spend Christmas Day at my aunt's house that year. I arrived the day before, on the 24th, to help them decorate and make arrangements for the Christmas celebration the next day. Later that night, we realized we needed extra Christmas lights, as the ones we had weren't enough. So, Mike, my aunt's son, and I decided to head out to get some. I took the keys to my aunt's car and headed out. My aunt stood at the doorway, wrapping a scarf tightly around her neck. "Don't be too long, okay?" she said, her voice laced with the warmth only mothers seem to have, and then she turned to me and told me to drive carefully. Mike waved dismissively, flashing a grin. "Relax, Mom. We'll be back before you can say Merry Christmas." I chuckled, rolling my eyes at his overconfidence. "You mean before you can spell it," I muttered under my breath. My aunt, hearing what I had just said, burst into laughter. The night air was crisp, and the smell of pine lingered as we walked to the car. Mike had always bragged about how good he was at driving, despite never having really learned. As we headed out the door, he began insisting on handling the vehicle, and although I was a bit skeptical, with the holiday spirit in full swing, I didn't argue. It was around 10 p.m. as we headed out on the highway. Mike was behind the wheel, and I sat in the passenger seat. Everything was going fine at first, with Christmas music playing on the radio. Mike was especially excited because he had recently convinced me that he was now a pro at driving. "I mean, look at me. I am basically a Formula One driver," he joked, swerving the car a little too much for my comfort. "Sure, and maybe you should behave appropriately before traffic violation tickets start coming your way as presents," I replied. We laughed for a bit, but then we heard a sudden noise. Out of nowhere, something was thrown onto the highway, landing just ahead of us. Mike immediately slammed on the brakes, trying to avoid whatever had just been tossed onto the road. But because he wasn't experienced enough, he panicked and didn't handle the car well. The tires screeched as he tried to regain control, but the car skidded, veering off the road and crashing hard onto the pavement. Before we could figure out what exactly had just happened, a man appeared, running toward the car from the shadows of the highway. He began shouting at us to get down. He had a silencer-equipped gun pointed at the driver's window, and then he fired. I ducked instinctively as the shot hit Mike in the leg, right through the window. He immediately opened the door and pulled Mike out. Mike screamed in pain as he collapsed onto the road. At that same time, I opened my own side of the door, scrambled out, and lay on the floor, distant from the vehicle. The man then climbed into the driver's seat of our car and drove off. As the car sped away, the wheels ran over Mike's leg. Mike couldn't help but scream while he was bleeding heavily from the wound. I rushed over to him, trying to stop the bleeding as I called for an ambulance. As we sat waiting for the ambulance, I looked at Mike and remembered something he had said before we left for the lights. "You told me you wanted this Christmas to be unforgettable," I said softly. He chuckled, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye, and said, "Well, I certainly got my wish." We both smiled. I said it to hopefully help him laugh and get his mind off the pain a little. Within minutes, medical help arrived. Mike was attended to and eventually taken to the hospital. The police arrived soon after, questioning us for hours. The car was later found abandoned on a remote stretch of the highway, with no trace of the robber. Mike's parents were furious when they found out, They yelled at him for not listening and driving when he clearly wasn't ready. They also directed some of their anger toward me, blaming me for not stopping Mike from driving. I couldn't argue with them. I knew I should have been more careful, but the entire situation had spiraled out of control so quickly. We were just two young people trying to get some Christmas lights, but it had turned into something we would never forget. Though Mike recovered at the hospital, he faced a long road to full recovery. The bullet wound and the pressure from the car's tires left him with scars, but thankfully, he would be okay. The season had always been full of joy and laughter, but the memory of that Christmas Eve haunted us all for a long time. Please do not forget to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe. Your support is greatly needed.